what I wanted to say about the start of the book is it's now 100 years since drugs were first banned. And when I realised 4 years ago that we were coming up to that anniversary, I was conscious that it was an issue I've been thinking about all my life. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to, and as I got older, realising that there was addiction in my family. And I think of myself as a pretty well-informed person about public affairs, and I had been following this issue for a long time because I wrote about it. And I realised that there were loads of just really basic questions that I didn't know the answer to. Like, why did we go to war against drug users and drug addicts 100 years ago? Why do we continue with this approach? What do the alternatives look like in practice? And what really causes drug use and drug addiction? And so I started reading to see where these answers were. And what surprised me is so much of this debate is couched in like abstract terms. So you'd read these things as if like you were at a philosophy seminar and you were talking about how the world should be. And I thought, I don't want to understand this issue that way. I don't want to understand it through arguments, even more applied arguments. What I wanted to do was sit with people whose lives had been changed one way or another by this approach and the alternatives, and just listen to them and see how their stories related to the bigger story. So I ended up going on a journey that I didn't think would be as big as it ended up being when I started, but I ended up going across 30,000 miles in 9 countries. And what I wanted to do was just sit with a really big range of people, and it ended up ranging from a transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, to speaking with a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see what will happen, and if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country that's ever decriminalised all drugs from cannabis to crack, with incredible results. And I guess the main thing I wanted to, I realised, and that I wanted to kind of just say as a little setup, and then we're going to go to some of the specific things, and Tony and Kath, I'm really grateful to you for setting this up, are going to ask some questions, is almost everything we think we know about this subject, almost everything I thought I knew about this subject, is wrong. Drug use is not what we think it is. Drug addiction is not what we think it is. The drug war is not what we've been told it is for the last 100 years. And the alternatives aren't what we think they are. So it's kind of exciting to realise we're at a moment when so much of what we think we know is wrong. I wanted to understand why all this began. And if you'd said to me, why were drugs banned 100 years ago, I would have guessed the reason that I guess if we stopped the next 20 people who walked down Farringdon Road, the reason they would give, which is, you don't want kids to use drugs, you don't want people to become addicted. What was so fascinating going back and looking at the archives for the debates about why drugs were banned and then what happened next, is that stuff barely comes up. It was founded for a very different reason, and it's one that I tell in the book through the story of someone you've probably all heard of. In 1939, in Midtown Manhattan, Billie Holiday stood on stage and she sang the song Strange Fruit, which is a song against lynching. Her goddaughter Lorraine Feather said to me that you have to understand how unbelievably shocking this was, to have an African-American woman standing up in front of a white audience in a hotel where she wasn't allowed to walk through the front door and singing a song against white supremacy, at a time when most pop songs were like, P.S. I love you, There were no political pop songs at that time. And that night, according to her biographer, Julia Blackburn, Billie Holiday got a warning from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and they said, stop singing this song. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was run by a man called Harry Anslinger, who I think is the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. He was he was a bureaucrat, and he took over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition was ending. So he's got this big department with loads of demoralised officers and nothing to do. And he invents the modern drug war, and he was really driven by 2 intense hatreds. And it's really striking when you read his stuff, and I went through all his archives and you look at it. He's driven by an intense hatred of addicts and an intense hatred of African Americans. This is a guy who was regarded as a crazy racist by the crazy racists in the 1930s, right? He used the N-word so often in official memos that his own senator said he should have to resign. And Billie Holiday was to him the symbol of everything that was wrong with America. An African American woman resisting white people. He hated jazz. He thought it was like disorder and chaos. At the same time that he found out that Billie Holiday was a drug addict, he found out Judy Garland, Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, was a drug addict. He told Judy Garland to take slightly longer holidays and assured her studio she was going to be fine. With Billie Holiday, he reacted a little bit differently. He stalked her and played a role in killing her. First guy he sends to stalk her is a guy called Jimmy Fletcher. Harry Anslinger hated employing African Americans, but you couldn't really employ a white guy, send them into Harlem to follow Billie Holiday around, it'd be kind of obvious. So they employed this guy called Jimmy Fletcher. Jimmy Fletcher follows her around for 2 years, watches her everywhere. And Billie Holiday was so awesome, Jimmy Fletcher fell in love with her. You know, she had promised herself as a little girl growing up in segregated Baltimore, where she wasn't even allowed into a lot of the stores because she was African American, that she would never bow her head to any white man. And so she was just determined, whatever they did to her, to just tell them to fuck off, basically. But Jimmy Fletcher really felt ashamed for the rest of his life for what he did to Billie Holiday. He busts her on Anslinger's orders. She's put on trial. She said the trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday, and that's how it felt. She's sent to prison, and when she gets out, the worst thing happens. The thing that we do to addicts all over the world, here in Britain, in America, everywhere, almost everywhere in the world, is done to Billie Holiday. We take away the thing she loves. We take away her ability to work. In places like this, you needed a cabaret performer's license to perform anywhere where alcohol was sold. They wouldn't give it to her. She couldn't sing. Her friend Yolanda Bavan said to me it was the cruelest thing you could imagine to take away singing from Billie Holiday. She always tried to find somewhere she could sing that song, but it was really difficult. And she relapsed. And when she was in her early 40s, she collapsed in Midtown Manhattan. And she's taken to hospital, and the hospital refused to take her because she was an addict. She was taken to another hospital, and she was convinced that the narcotics agents were not finished with her. She said to one of her friends, "They're going to kill me in there. Don't let them, they're going to kill me." On her bed, what eventually became her deathbed, she was diagnosed with liver cancer, and she started to go into heroin withdrawal, which is obviously quite dangerous when you're very weak with cancer. They handcuffed her to the bed. They took away all her stuff. They arrested her on the bed, even though they knew she had liver cancer. They didn't let any of her friends in to see her. They took away her record player, her candies, everything she had. One of her friends manages to insist that she was given methadone, and she began to recover. And then they cut off the methadone, and the next day she died. One of her friends said that she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. I think it tells you a lot about the dynamics of the early drug war, what's going on there, what we do to addicts. Race is a big element of what we do now with the drug war here in Britain and in America. I can tell you about that later. But there's one thing I took from this that massively, more than anything else, more than the horror of it, it really helped me to think about the addicts in my life, which was something that her friend Annie Ross, who's also a great jazz singer, said to me. She said that Billie Holiday wasn't weak. Billie Holiday was as strong as she could be. Whatever they did to her, she always sang that song. She always went somewhere, and she always found somewhere they'd take her. It didn't matter if it was the South and people threatened to kill her, she sang her song against lynching. And to realise that addicts can be heroic, anyone who's got addicts in their life, and I know there's people in this room who have, it can be very frustrating to realise that addicts can be heroes, to realise that because of Billie Holiday's resistance, you know, while we're talking all over the world, people are listening to Billie Holiday and they feel stronger. And I think that tells us as much about how we end the drug war as the story tells us about why it started. It's important to understand, right, Harry Anslinger was a product of his time as well. So he was brilliant at playing on the fears of his time, but I'm not a believer in like the great man theory of history. You know, he's like a great surfer who finds a great wave. You know, without the wave, you can't do anything. And he's obviously playing on very deep racist undercurrents within the US, you know, at the time. So he's as much an expression of that. I think it's partly hedonism. I think it's also just crazier things that we would just now regard as bizarre, just like so much of the past seems bizarre to us. I'll give you a good example, something that affects everyone in this room in one way or another, not least through our taxes, if nothing else. When he takes over the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he said that marijuana he wasn't worried about it. It's not harmful, not addictive, not bothered. And basically, heroin and cocaine just weren't that big in America at the time. So he needed something bigger to justify his department. He suddenly announces, there's no rival science or anything, he suddenly announces that marijuana is worse than heroin, literally. And he latches onto this case of a boy called Victor LaCarta, who's a boy in Florida in his early 20s who hacked his family to death with an axe. And with the help of the Fox News of its day, which is Hearst newspapers, Anslinger suddenly announces, this is what will happen if you smoke marijuana. You will hack you will hack your family to death with an axe. Years later, someone goes back and looks at this boy's psychiatric files. There's not even any evidence he used marijuana. He'd been insane for a long time. There was insanity in his family. So I think it's more, kind of hedonism is one of the kind of riffs in what he's doing, but I think it goes much deeper than that, and it goes to covers many more ideas than that. It's worth remembering, so prior to all of this, drugs were legal, right? You could go to your local shop and you could buy whatever you wanted. And it's really interesting. The most popular, it's fascinating. You look at the year before drugs are banned, there was a study that looked at drug addicts, not even drug users, drug addicts. They had depleted lives like alcoholics had depleted lives. They overwhelmingly had jobs. They were no more likely to be poor than other Americans. They were, it was a problem, but it wasn't, they were no more likely to be criminal than anyone else, engage in criminal activity. And then suddenly you have criminalization and a whole series of disasters occur. There were problems before, and then things get significantly worse. And one of the fascinating things about the early drug war is how massively it was resisted. Right from the start, you have huge numbers of people saying, this isn't going to work, and not marginal figures. The mayor of Los Angeles, popularly elected, stands in front of a heroin prescribing clinic and says words to the effect of, you will not shut this down. This works really well for us. They had to arrest 17,000 doctors all over America who resisted and carried on prescribing drugs to addicts, even after the criminalization. So this was hugely disputed. It's not like people go, oh, this is a bad thing, let's ban it, and everyone just goes along with it. It's only really the suppression of really 17,000 doctors being destroyed, and then they all shut up. It's that kind of thing, and that happens to a lot of people, and really the intimidation of people. It was amazing looking at Anslinger's stuff, how many people he silenced, that then the debate kind of vanishes and doesn't come back for quite a long time.
Just going back to that, to your last point, that there were a lot of people that actually didn't agree with this prohibition. How then did it, I know you've sort of answered this, but I'd just love to know more about why it did get passed then. Why did people agree to this?
Well, it was regarded as a relatively minor issue. It affected a relatively small number of people at the time, and it totally fit in with racist hysterias. It's incredible. You look at the I don't want to say some of the words, but official statements like, it was very widely believed that African Americans and Chinese Americans were taking drugs, forgetting their place, and attacking white people. And this was a very useful explanation for why African Americans and Chinese Americans were really pissed off and why they were rebelling, right? You can see why white people wanted to believe, oh, if we just get rid of these powders and pills, then they'll just go back into their place. So it fit with a much wider cultural trend of what was going on at the time. It fits with actually the next person I wanted to talk about, and it goes right to the present day. One of the people I got to know well is an amazing woman called Lee Maddox, who always reminded me, does anyone remember that when most people hear about my age, it was a TV series starring Heather Locklear when we were kids called TJ Hooker, which is where she was like this really, she wasn't a hooker, she was a really tough, that was very insulting to Lee, she was a really tough kind of badass female cop, blonde female cop. No matter how many times I got to know Lee, I could not picture Heather Locklear whenever I met her. And in the year 2000, Lee stood on the I-95, which is the main what we would call motorway into Baltimore, and she was like Harry Anslinger's dream girl. Lee was a really tough anti-drugs cop, and she spent her time relentlessly busting people for anything, even a joint. She would go after them, and it was her job to kind of fish out cars and crack down, and she led crackdowns all over the state. And Lee had signed up for this job for the strongest possible motive. When she was in her early 20s, her best friend Lisa, who she'd been best friends with since she was a little girl, who they were like they looked incredibly similar. They used to share IDs and things. Lisa was murdered by what Lee believed was a drug gang. And that day, Lee went and got the sign-up papers and said, I want to be a cop because I want to fucking destroy these drug gangs. And so for a long time, she does all the arrests. She fights the drug war to the hardest. She gets other assignments as well, really brave assignments. She goes undercover with the Ku Klux Klan when she was living with an African-American boyfriend, and had a really terrifying undercover experience. She did quite a lot of undercover work. But Lee is an honest person, and Lee noticed things that a lot of cops notice, but choose not to think about until Lee was forced to confront it in a way I'll get to. Lee noticed, firstly, that even though African Americans are no more likely to use drugs than any other group in the United States, they made up and Lee herself had smoked weed when she was younger. they made up the overwhelming majority of people who they went and arrested. Someone who Lee got to know later, a guy called Matthew Fogg, was a cop at the same time. And he went to his boss one day and he said, the exact words are in the book, but words to the effect of, "Hey boss, I've noticed something. How come when we go to do drug raids, we only ever go to the black neighborhoods? I'm pretty sure white people use drugs." And his boss said words to the effect of, "Well, you're damn right, of course they do. But white people get lawyers and no judges, and poorer African Americans don't, so we'll go for the low-hanging fruit." So Lee noticed that dynamic. And Lee noticed something else which seemed to her a bit weirder, which is that when you're a cop and you bust, say, a rapist, the next day, the next week, the next month, there is less rape in your town. If you bust a drug dealer, two things happen. Firstly, someone else is on the corner the next day. We know this because price doesn't go up when you leave bus. So you don't get any fewer people getting drugs the next day. But something else happens. Violence does go up. The homicide rate does go up. And Lee thought, this is like weird, why would that be? And she then started to read about it and learn about it. And basically what happens is, when you ban drugs, when you do what Anslinger did at that time, drugs don't disappear, right? They're transferred from doctors and pharmacists, the people who used to sell them, to armed criminal gangs, right? Those armed criminal gangs are inherently violent, not because there's anything to do with drugs, for a simple reason. If we go out of here onto Farringdon Road, I didn't look, but I'm sure there's an off-licence somewhere near here, right? If we go out and we storm there and we try to rob that off-licence and we try to steal their beer or their vodka, they'll call the cops and the cops will arrest us, right? So they don't need to be violent, they don't need to be threatening. If we go to the local weed dealer or the local coke dealer and we try to steal their things, obviously he can't call the police because they'll arrest him. He has to be threatening, he has to be violent. He doesn't actually want to be fighting people every day, so you want to establish a reputation for being such a badass that no one will dare to fuck with you. That's where the violence from the drug trade comes from. It's not about drugs, it's not about people using drugs any more than Al Capone wasn't drunk. It's about the nature of prohibition. If we banned milk and people still wanted milk, the milk trade would work that way. Lee was beginning to figure that out, and she felt bad about it, but she also didn't know what to do about it. And one day, one of her colleagues, Ed Totley, one of her best friends, an amazing guy who was a huge fighter for women's rights within the Maryland PD, went to a drug bust, kind of drug bust that him and Lee had done 1,000 times. And as he paid, the guy doing the deal, didn't know he was a cop, pulled out a gun and shot him in the head. And Ed died immediately. And Lee began to think, I can't do this. I know that he has died for nothing. In fact, she went into the police to bankrupt drug gangs. She realized that what she was doing, the whole edifice of prohibition, is what keeps the drug gangs in business. Lee quit the cops. She retrained as a lawyer. She now spends her time getting the convictions of people like the people she arrested quashed wherever she can. And I think Lee's journey is a really interesting one to think about when we think about how to end this, that actually it's the people at the very front line of this who are the people who see its flaws most clearly. In 2005, there was a boy in a summer camp, an American boy in a summer camp, called Rosalio Retta. And it was a summer camp like a lot of summer camps in America. You used to sing songs and you'd be taught stuff and you'd go to do activities. Except Rosalio, who was at the time 15, his summer camp was a bit different. What they taught at this summer camp was how to behead people and how to dissolve corpses. Rosalio had been recruited for a Mexican drug cartel. He grew up in Texas, in a town called Laredo, which is on the border. His dad was Mexican. His mother was an American citizen. And Rosalio, it's one of those towns, it's weird, people who've been to the Texas-Mexico border will know. It's really weird, they're like these cities, they're like basically the same place, but with the border in between them. It'd be like if North London and South London were different countries. And I've got a friend here who does actually think that's the case. But it would be like if it were that way, right? So Mexican kids would go back and forth across the border the whole time. And in Rosalio's story, during the drug war, there's this thing that happens the whole time, right? Where you take an area, you spend a fortune cracking down on the drug routes going through it, and the drug routes just move somewhere else, right? So in the 80s, there's a huge movement. One of the main routes into the United States, Colombia, they go up through the Caribbean into Miami. That's the Miami Vice. I don't know why I keep referring to shitty 80s TV series tonight, but that's the Miami Vice. Yes, Miami Vice, right? And then they spend an absolute fortune cracking down in Florida and the Caribbean, and it just moves to Mexico. And one of the places it moves to is Laredo and Nuevo Laredo and Juarez and El Paso, where suddenly the drug trade starts to go through there, and suddenly that river of drugs, prohibited drugs, and all the dynamics that Lee was seeing in Baltimore, and we can see on the streets here in London, a lot of these stabbings in London, they move to Laredo, Nuevo Laredo. And what happens is, basically, if you think about a housing estate near here, right, or where I live in Archway, the estate near where I live, right, I would guess, I haven't done any research on this, but I would guess 5 to 10% of the estate near where I live is in the illegal drug trade, right? That makes that estate an absolutely horrible place to live because of all the violence that comes with it and intimidation and so on. In Ciudad Juarez, on the American border, 70% of the economy is in the hands of armed criminal gangs controlling the drug trade, right? So you imagine how bad that estate is, times it by 1,000, you get some sense. And that means that the drug gangs are by far the wealthiest people in that place. And Rosalio is a 13-year-old boy. When he's a 13-year-old boy, he wants to a part of it. It's the only thing that's got any money. It's the only thing that's got any excitement. And there's a dispute about how he exactly gets involved. He claims that they kidnapped him and forced him to do it. The evidence is pretty clear that he goes and volunteers. But set that aside. He goes, he's taken to Nuevo Laredo, the Mexican side of the border, to a warehouse where about 40 people are bound and tied up, and some of them are being burned alive, and he's told to shoot one in the face, and he shoots one of these guys in the face. He never knows who this guy is. And that's the moment when he gets sucked into the vortex of the Zetas. He's used as a hitman by Miguel Trevino, who was at that time number 3 in the Zetas, later became number 1. The Zetas are the deadliest Mexican drug cartel. And over the next few years, he beheads, shoots, or kills with hand grenades about 70 people. And when I met him, he's in a prison in Texas. Rosalio, what you really see in Rosalio's story, there's loads of things about Rosalio's story that I think are fascinating, but very quickly, I'll tell you one. What you see is the dynamic that Lee saw in Baltimore that we see playing out here. There's something, a really important element of this. What we were saying about we can't go into the local liquor store and steal their goods. They have to establish a reputation for being terrifying. That plays out in a place like Mexico in a horrific way. Because if you are the person who is prepared to break a taboo and become a little bit more terrifying than the other guy, then you get a competitive advantage. So if you're the first person who's prepared to not just kill the other side, but kill their wives, you get a brief competitive advantage. If you're the first guy who's prepared to kill their wives, their pregnant wives, and put it on YouTube, you get a brief competitive advantage. If you're the first person to go and cut off the other side's faces, sew it to a football, and post it to their relatives, this thing that actually happened, that's one of their practices, then you get a brief competitive advantage. So sometimes when you look at what Rosalio did, and it was difficult to sit opposite him and hear him describe this, and you hear about it, it can just sound like Jeffrey Dahmer-style psychosis, right? And at one level, obviously, you have to be fairly deranged to do this. But another level, it is entirely the logic of the system we've created. It's what happened with alcohol dealers in Chicago in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal. Where are the violent alcohol dealers now? They don't exist. Nothing's changed about alcohol. What's changed is whether we prohibit it or regulate it. The same thing is true of this violence in Mexico. And spending time in Juarez and time with Rosalio, I really got a sense there are many horrors about the drug war and many tragedies. And Rosalio, I actually feel very sorry for. He's up for parole when he's in his mid-80s. He lives in constant solitary confinement because whenever they let him out, someone just immediately stabs him because they know they'll get loads of money from the Zetas because he's the only person to ever speak and, come out the other side. Of the many tragedies, what we are doing to the people on the supply routes is, for me, far and away the worst. I'll just give you one quote and then hand over. Michelle Leonhardt, who's the head of the American Drug Enforcement Agency, which is the main policing body for drugs in America, was asked about the fact in a Senate testimony that 60,000 people, Mexican civilians, have died in the last 6 years. It's actually higher than that, but that's the figure she was given. And she asked what she thought of that. And the phrase she used was that it was a sign of success in the war on drugs. That should be an international scandal.
Are there things you can take which don't have this incredibly damaging and murderous backstory? For example, things that are made in labs like MDMA or LSD. Is it all drugs, all illegal drugs, which have this murderous
I think
backstory.
I think that the question about blaming individual drug users and holding them morally responsible for this, I think is very problematic. When we think about what went wrong with alcohol prohibition in the 20s, we don't blame beer drinkers. We blame the people who put in place the madness of alcohol prohibition. I'm wearing, where's this from? Ben Sherman. I'm pretty sure this was stitched by Bangladeshi sweatshops, right? I've been to Bangladeshi sweatshops. My friend Joe, who's in the audience somewhere, has my phone. My phone was almost certainly made by Chinese slaves with Congolese coltan. I covered the war in the Congo. It's the deadliest war since the Holocaust. 6 million people have died. That coltan is the direct cause of it. The lights are on in this room. Almost certainly kept on with natural gas. Natural gas is a big driver of global warming. Loads of people are going to die in that. In a society where people are, including me, massively complicit in all sorts of international horrors, we kind of single out drug users and go, you should feel really bad for what you do. Well, yeah, in the same way that we should all feel bad for all of those things and loads of other things that I haven't even named. If we want to deal with those things, it's part of my disagreement with fair trade. I like fair trade products. I try to buy them when I can. I think they're fine. But if they drain the political energy from actually meaning we shouldn't have a international trading system that forces neoliberalism on the poorest people in the world, then if they give people a sense, well, I'm morally pure and therefore I've done my bit, then I think they're really problematic. The only moral thing to do in the situation with the trading system we have is to campaign to change the trading system. A couple of nice people at the margins being a bit nicer is fine, but it's trivial compared to that. In the same way, if we want to deal with these horrors, we've got to end drug prohibition. I can talk about what that means, and it probably doesn't mean what a lot of people here are thinking it means, or what a lot of people hear when you say that. But the idea that you would have there is no fair trade. There obviously are no fair trade drugs. And there is some moral responsibility for the individual user, but the system is the much bigger thing. And if there was a line of fair trade that could be opened up, I would regard that as a relatively trivial matter. Obviously, things that are made in labs are less problematic, and although they're still problematic, they're still contaminated. That's why you get all these deaths, because you can't regulate an illegal product. You can't send health and safety inspectors to inspect the bowels of drug mules. But yeah, I think that in a way, that argument, which you're right to bring up, because a lot of people bring it up, is a massive red herring and a massive distraction. Sorry, that sounded very dismissive. Great. Hello.
Hey, just a quick
You're
question.
like a silhouette to me.
Yeah, silhouette. You mentioned energy and clothes and telephones and as examples of products that are all sort of morally compromised. Is there any sort of trade-off between utility and pleasure that obviously drugs don't necessarily have quite the same legitimate use for functioning daily lives?
I know what you're saying. That's a good point. They're more like they're more like fair trade chocolate than they are like, although actually we could all live without smartphones, probably have better lives. So I'm not sure about that. I understand the point you're making, but first there's a lot of people who are addicted for whom the drug is really a huge part of their life. And in a way I think I know what you're saying, but I think it's kind of a side issue, because I think if we regulate them through a legal process, as several countries have tried that I went to, and I can tell you about that, then we don't have any problem with those things. So, yeah.
If the current system is kind of dismantled and drugs decriminalised and that kind of channel is destroyed, what do you think happens to people like the Zetas? What do you think happens to them? How are they reabsorbed back into the rest of society? Where do they go after that? Because their business is effectively destroyed.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So criminals respond to, all the evidence is that criminals respond to market incentives like everyone else. And what we've done at the moment is transfer one of the largest industries in the world from doctors and pharmacists to criminals who can make a 6,000% profit margin from the point of the coca being grown to the point of it being sold. If it's transferred to doctors and pharmacists, this is what we can see this because we can look at what's happening in Colorado and Washington where they've legalized cannabis and in Switzerland where they legalized heroin for addicts. What happens is the legal outlets have a much cheaper product because you've got to pay people quite a big premium to risk going to prison to sell a product. So the price goes massively up. And you've got to pay everyone in the supply chain a premium. So the price goes right down. You can make that price difference up with taxing, but it's And it's a much better product because you can have inspectors, it's not contaminated, it's not a shit product. So basically what you find is where there's a legal alternative, the market for the illegal alternative rapidly disappears. So what you would see is, and it's a good, important question, because the best historical parallel we have is what happened with alcohol prohibition, where what happened is some of them move into the people who had controlled the trade in illegal alcohol. Some move into other forms of criminality, and we have to be candid about that. They go and set up Las Vegas, for example, and gambling was largely illegal then. Some of them move into other forms of crime. Most of them just respond to the market incentive and get jobs in the legitimate economy. There's a really interesting graph. Professor Jeffrey Myron, who's a professor at Harvard, did a graph looking at the murder rate in the United States, right? And it massively spikes during alcohol prohibition and massively falls when it ends, and only spikes again when you have a massive intensification of drug prohibition in the 70s. It's not the only factor, but it will give you some sense of what would happen in those places. You would see a really big fall in the murder rate. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said you would have a fall of 10,000 murders a year in the US. You would see a return to. You could begin to have the Mexican state taking back control of Mexico, because obviously the criminal gangs wouldn't control 70% of the economy in the same way. It would take time, there would be bumps in the road, but I think you would see a really significant improvement.
I was interested about what you said about how when sort of the 80s Miami Vice period, when there was the crackdown in Florida, Miami, and then the drug trade moved to Mexico, and this sort of bubble theory where, like, as you crack down on drugs, the drugs move to the passage of least resistance. So now I think what we're seeing in Mexico is sort of moving to Central America, and people are looking to the future. Some people think West Africa might be the next sort of most vulnerable place for this sort of mass-scale regional violence. I just want to ask, from what you saw on like how drug policy is changing, do you think it will change fast enough to prevent another region of the world falling to like this terrible crimes, which is found in Colombia, Mexico, and now Central America? That's
such an important question. The most interesting person I spoke to about that was Jose Mujica, the president of just stood down a couple of days ago. The president of didn't stand down. His term ended. President of Uruguay, one of the most amazing men I've ever met, and his stories in the book. I've ever talked with. He led the Tupamaro guerrilla uprising against the government in the 70s. He was kept at the bottom of a well for 4 years by the dictatorship, and emerged to lead his country. He lived in a shack while he was president. I went to the shack. David Cameron wouldn't keep his shoes in the place where Jose Mujica lives, this is his core argument. He legalized marijuana and wanted to legalize more drugs for exactly that reason. He said, look, if these routes shift around again and they come our way, we're defenseless. It's a country with whatever it is, 3.5 million people. They don't have much of a military. There would just be nothing they could do. They would just be destroyed. And he said exactly what you say. And he talks about, I don't remember his exact words, but he said, if we don't deal with this, us and all the other small countries in the world on supply routes are going to be hugely vulnerable. I don't think it's going to end in time to prevent other horrors, but the sooner we fight for it, the sooner it'll end, and the fewer people will die in that way. Okay, shall I talk? I wanted to understand about what really causes addiction, and in a way I thought I already knew, and this was the thing in the book. A lot of the things we're talking about, I didn't know the details, I didn't know the individual stories, but I sort of knew the contours of it. With this, I just didn't. I had vaguely read about it when I was a student and really not absorbed it at all, and certainly didn't understand the implications of this. If you had said to me 4 years ago, what causes heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were a little bit of a simpleton, and I would have said, well, heroin causes heroin addiction. We've been told a story about drug use for the last century that's become like just part of our common sense, right? We think that if the next 20 people on this side of the room, no disrespect to Sheila, if we all used heroin together for 20 days, on day 21, we'd all be heroin addicts, because we think the way addiction works, a lot of us think the way addiction works is because there are chemical hooks in the drug, our body would start to physically need the drug on day 21, and that's what addiction is. The first thing that alerted me to the fact that there may be something wrong about that theory is when I interviewed an amazing man called Dr. Gabor Mate in Vancouver. who works with hardcore addicts. He explained to me, if any of us step out of here today onto Farringdon Road and get hit by a car and we break our hips, we'll be taken to hospital. It's quite likely we'll be given diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's much better heroin than you'd score on the streets around the corner because it's medically pure, whereas the street heroin is about 20% purity and full of shit. There's a good chance you'll be given that diamorphine for quite a long time, right? Anyone, any hospital near you, there are people being given heroin for quite long periods of time. If what we think about addiction is right, what should happen? Those people should leave, at least some of them, a significant number should leave hospital as addicts. They should try to score on the streets. You will have noticed your grandmother was not turned into a junkie by her hip operation, right? Something else must be going on. And when I learned that, I didn't really know what to do with it. It just seemed so weird until I went and met a guy called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor, also a professor, also in Vancouver, who did an experiment that's really important. He explained to me the idea of addiction that we have, that's the one that we all implicitly believe, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. When you go home, if you feel a little bit sadistic, you can do them yourself. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and one is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself within a couple of weeks, right? There was a famous advert in America, a bit like our Tombstone AIDS advert, but their addiction advert, which showed that experiment and then said something like, "It will happen to you." And there you go. That's our theory of addiction, right? It fits very well with what we think about addiction. It's part of the origins of our theory of addiction. Bruce came along in the 70s and said, hang on a minute, we're putting the rat in an empty cage, right? It's got nothing to do except drink the drugged water. Let's do this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park. Rat Park is like heaven for rats, right? Anything your rat about town could want, it's got in Rat Park. It's got cheese, it's got coloured balls, it's got tunnels, it's got loads of friends, it can have loads of sex. And it's got both the water bottles, the drugged water and the normal water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, the rats don't like the drugged water. They obviously try both the bottles because they don't know what's in them. They hardly drink any of the drugged water. None of them ever use it in a way that looks compulsive. None of them ever overdose. There's a really important human example. I think there's human examples going on all around us, but there was a really interesting human example going on at the same time, but I'll get to in a second. But what Bruce says is, this shows that both the right-wing theory of addiction and the left-wing theories of addiction are wrong. The right-wing theory is, you're a hedonist, exactly what Tony was saying. Tony was paraphrasing, ascribing to them rightly. You party too hard, you indulge yourself. It's a moral failing. The kind of Peter Hitchens view, right? The left-wing view is it takes over your brain, it hijacks you. You can fill in the blanks, right? What Bruce says is, it's not your morality, it's not your brain. To a large degree, it's your cage. Addiction is an adaptation to your environment. There's a guy called Peter Cohen, who's a professor in the Netherlands, who writes about this. He says that we shouldn't even use the phrase bonding. We shouldn't use the phrase the addiction. We should talk about bonding. Human beings have an innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we will bond with the people around us. And when we aren't happy and healthy, because we're beaten down or traumatized or isolated, we will bond with something that gives us a sense of relief. Now, that might be pornography, that might be gambling, that might be cocaine. Those are much closer than you'd think. But we will bond with something. The human example, one of the many human examples, at the same time as Rat Park, there was an experiment going on called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of American soldiers were using heroin a lot. And if you look at the news stories from the time, people were really worried because they thought, my God, when the war ends, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States. What happened? They came home and almost entirely, 95%, just stopped. They didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into painful withdrawal. They didn't have any nightmares. They stopped. Because if you're taken out of a hellish pestilential jungle where you could die at any moment, and you go back to a nice life in Wichita, Kansas, with your friends and your family, it's the equivalent of being taken out of the first cage and being put into Rat Park. There's loads of things that come out of that, but I'll just say one. We've created a society where for a lot of people, life is more like life in that first cage than it is like Rat Park. Bruce says we talk a lot in addiction about individual recovery, and that has real value. but we need to talk a lot more about social recovery. You know, something has gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. Oh, I'll hand over to you.
At one point in the book, you describe, when you're describing the theory of addiction as being essentially, addiction is something that comes out of alienation or dislocation. You say, actually, we're addicted to lots of things, and one of the things we're addicted to is consumer goods, and that the consumer goods are giving us that same kind of that same kind of sense of bonding that that we crave. So, if we think about deprohibition, whatever the program is, in a sense, that's not getting to the root cause, is it? Because in a sense, we've got a problem with addiction, and that's addiction, as you say, to all sorts of things, including to things which are incredibly destructive of the world and the environment. So, in a way, your book goes much further than being an argument about deprohibition. It's how would we fix the underlying problem? What's your view of that?
There's a much longer answer to that I won't give, but you're totally right. I think the first thing to notice is we have a drug policy that actually makes addiction worse, is the first thing to say. You're totally right. Solutions to these problems, the problem of addiction, goes way wider than drug policy. But it's worth bearing in mind, like, for example, you think about what we did to Billie Holiday, right? Once you know that disconnection and being cut off from your sources of meaning are major drivers of addiction, suddenly the madness of giving criminal records to addicts so they can't ever get jobs and can't ever get back into the normal world, you realise how bad that is. I mean, there's a very extreme example. In Arizona, I went out with a female chain gang of women who are drug addicts who were forced to go out wearing T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and made to dig graves and be humiliated in public. And afterwards I went back, and actually the second day I went there, I think, and a lot of the women are put into solitary confinement for like nothing, for the most trivial offences by these disgusting guards. And I said, oh, could I see the solitary confinement? They call it the Hole. It really is like Orange is the New Black. And I was sure they wouldn't show me, and they just took me and Rachel, the documentary maker who was with me. And I saw these women in these cages who were there because they were addicts. And suddenly I thought, this is the closest you could possibly get to a literal human recreation of the cages that guarantee addiction with rats, right? And that's what we do to respond to addiction. It's just crazy. So I think the first thing to say is we need to stop having a policy that makes addiction worse and start having a policy that actually helps addicts turn their lives around, and there's a place that's done that, and we'll get to that. Second point is we need much wider social change, and I'll just give a couple of sentences on that because obviously it's a massive topic. All throughout the book I've tried to never talk in abstract terms. I've tried to talk about real places and real people. And we can look at, there are societies that have very low levels of addiction. Scandinavia, right? They are societies with very low insecurity, very good welfare states, extremely high social mobility. People don't get abandoned, they don't get written off. And then there are societies like Texas that have very high levels of insecurity, pain, suffering, very little welfare state, and they have very high levels of addiction. So, look, I was already a lefty, so I'm slightly biased, but we need to move much more towards those sides if we want to reduce addiction. It's important to understand I'm not saying that the story we have in our heads that there are chemical hooks is false. It's not false, it's just a small part of the picture. And nicotine actually helps us to measure how much it is. It's really interesting. So there's a very broad consensus among scientists in the field that nicotine is one of the most chemically, has some of the strongest chemical hooks of any drug. And we can identify what the chemical hook is. It's nicotine, right? It's not the chemically compelling component in smoking tobacco is nicotine. We know that because you can measure like the degree to which people feel withdrawal and craving after exposure to it. And so when nicotine patches were invented in the early 90s, there's this massive wave of optimism in the field because they're like, great. We can give people all of the drug they're addicted to and none of the filthy carcinogenic smoke. Brilliant. There's going to be a massive fall in smoking. Actually, it's probably, I'm sure there's people who've taken part in the experiment in this room. Only 17% of smokers who use nicotine patches stop. Now, that's certainly not nothing, right? 17% is a lot. That tells you that the chemical component is really significant. That leaves us 83% that have to be explained some other way. And I don't think, by the way, isolation is the sole explanation or disconnection. I do think it's a really big part of the picture. that's been left out. So I think the other thing I'd say about smoking is it does have strong anti-anxiety effects, smoking tobacco. And I don't think it's hard to see that we live in a very anxious society. And it's very interesting to look at historical trends in drug use, you know, like 18th century in this city, huge numbers of people are driven out of the countryside into these disgusting slums, and there's this massive gin craze, and everyone blames gin, right? It's like the crack of its time. Everyone says, oh, if only gin didn't exist, you know, if only we could ban gin, if only we could get rid of it, this misery would stop. And of course, we now have, I'm sure they literally sell gin at this bar, and the woman's waving to a man, I can't say, the man with the nice jumper from India is waving to indicate this is true. And we don't regard gin as like crack now. You know, you look at these trends. People talked a lot about why there's been a huge rise in addiction to prescription opiates since 2008 in America. Well, gee, let's think. Has anything happened since 2008 in America that could mean that lots of people are really miserable and suffering and finding it difficult to get through the day that's not related to the drug? Can anyone think of anything that happened in 2008? You know, it's really important. So I think clearly there is a chemical component to cigarette smoking. I also think we live in a really... It's not a coincidence that Scandinavia has much lower smoking rates than Britain. It's a much less anxious society. I want to talk about two aspects of the solution. So we talked about some of the problem. Legalization and ending the drug war does not mean what most people think it means. And again, when we talk about these questions, we tend to talk in this really abstract way, like what could that mean? I went to the places that have actually legalized, and I want to talk about what they're like. And one of the places where drugs were legal for a period is here in Britain, and in our lifetimes. And this is a kind of largely, not entirely, but a largely forgotten story. In 1982, a Welsh doctor called John Marks walked for the first day into the doctor's surgery he'd been assigned to in the Wirral, in Merseyside. I've learned that people in the Wirral do not like being called Liverpudlians, I don't know why. And it was a little grey, drizzly surgery in a place where they used to build ships and now they build nothing. And John was particularly interested in schizophrenia. It was like his intellectual interest. He wanted to go to this quite economically depressed area, wanted to understand schizophrenia. And his colleagues, who were doctors, said, you know what, you're the new boy, you can have the boring job. We prescribe heroin to about 20 people here, you can deal with them. And John said, what, you prescribe heroin to them, why? And they said, because they're addicts. And John said, that can't be right. That sounds like a really bad idea. And John had inadvertently stumbled across one of the last loopholes in the world in the drug war. When Harry Anslinger is shutting down the American, everyone who provides drugs legally in the United States, he imposes this using American diplomatic and military power on the whole world. There's a great quote that I think just summarises so much about the drug war. When one country's delegates said that they didn't want to do it and they're being pressured, Harry Anslinger said, I've made up my mind, don't try to confuse me with the facts. But there was one country that held out harder than anywhere else. The doctors in Britain refused to do it. They just said, these people are addicts. When we cut them off, they die, a lot of them, for various reasons, because they have to go to criminal gangs. We're going to carry on prescribing. And there was this little pocket in Britain where they carried on. And so John stumbled into it. And John was like, I'm not doing this, we're going to shut this down. And he goes to, and he calls in the addicts to meet them to basically say, look, game over, right? And John was struck by something really weird. These heroin addicts didn't look like any heroin addicts he'd ever met anywhere else. They didn't have any abscesses, they didn't have any lesions, they didn't have any wounds. They had jobs, all of them, almost all of them. They had kind of normal lives. And John was kind of baffled but not interested. It's just not it wasn't his thing, right? And he was going to go ahead and shut it down because it seemed so weird. And then, interesting, there was a directive from Thatcher's government that said that drug policy had to be independently evaluated. And of course, Thatcher's government were convinced that if it was independently evaluated, they would shut down all the liberal bits. And so an academic called Russell Newcomb comes in to assess this clinic. And he discovered loads of really odd things. Loads of the things that we associate with heroin addiction are in fact not caused by heroin addiction. They're caused by the prohibition of heroin. Because when these people were given medically pure, legal heroin and the clean needles with which to use it, all the things that flash into your mind when you hear heroin addiction don't happen. In the same way that we were talking before about people in hospital, the things that happen to them, like they don't become addicted. These people, they didn't develop all those problems. John and Russell started to think of those problems, things like contaminated wounds, as drug war wounds. Because, of course, when you're buying from armed criminal gangs, they fuck up the product. Anything that's smuggled through 7 layers of criminals before it gets to you is going to be a lot less good than something that's provided in sterile environments. And John thought, well, hang on, if we're keeping these 20 people alive, the middle of Merseyside in the 80s, why don't we do this with a lot more people? If we've just proven that it works, when Russell came back with all the research, why don't we extend this more? And so he extended it to 400 people. And he got people like a girl called Julia Scott, who was working as a sex worker. She comes in, she was prostituting herself to get heroin. She is given a heroin prescription, and she immediately stops prostitution and never goes back, and starts being a mum to a little girl. And John thinks, wow, this really works. Something else happened in the Wirral that no one anticipated. So when they started doing this, actually I should say before that, the people who were most enthusiastic about this, it goes back to what Tony and Kath were asking about earlier, were the police. There was a 93% fall in burglary when they massively expanded the heroin prescription program. Marks and Spencer's saw such a massive fall in shoplifting that they offered to sponsor a conference about how to roll this out across the country, right? You look at the quotes, there was a police officer called Mike Lofts, who said at the time, you would see these people go in a terrible state, and they'd walk out after a few months of the prescription like everyone else. You couldn't tell them apart from the receptionist or the nurses and doctors who worked there. That's slightly overstating it. They obviously had somewhat sluggish and depleted lives, but like when drugs were legal before, they had jobs, they went back to having normal lives. But here's the thing no one anticipated. So some people thought if you give out heroin free to people, more people will use drugs, for obvious reasons. Other people thought, well, it'll remain the same. What no one anticipated was what actually happened, which is the number of new heroin users significantly fell. And there were lots of theories about this, and Russell Newcomb, the academic who studied it, came up with what I think is probably the right theory, and has been demonstrated later. If you're a heroin addict in Britain under prohibition, you want to carry on feeding a habit, unless you're like, I don't know, an heir or something, you've inherited a fortune. You've basically got a few options to carry on feeding your really expensive habit. You can prostitute yourself, you can commit property crime, or the third option, which is by far the least onerous, you can be a dealer. So what happens under prohibition is that you're quite likely to become a dealer, and you've got a very strong motive to persuade other people to start using heroin because you want to get your next fix. The way Russell describes it is that under prohibition, heroin is like a pyramid scheme. There are companies that would love to have motivated people as motivated as heroin addicts. And what happens when you prescribe is that pyramid scheme ends that day because they've got no incentive to persuade anyone else because they're getting it from the doctor. So you saw this big fall in crime, you saw a big fall in addiction, you saw deaths among heroin addicts stopped. And this goes on for several years and it becomes pretty popular. And John, the massive American TV show 60 Minutes, which is like Panorama, comes and does a huge item about John and about this clinic, massively in favour of it. And very soon after, the Americans start to impose massive pressure on the British government to shut this the hell down. And John's clinic is handed over to Christian fundamentalists who don't believe in heroin prescription. John can't get a job anywhere. He ends up living in New Zealand, which is where I ended up speaking to him from. Bear in mind, between 1982 and 1995, he was prescribing to 400, and by the end it was 400 people. There were no deaths. Within the next 6 months, 40 people died. One of them was Julia Scott, that woman that I told you about, the woman who had been prostitute. Death rate in the Wirral among addicts has gone back to what it was before John's experiment, which is the same as the death rate of people who got smallpox. But something amazing happened, which is that there were Swiss doctors who came to visit, and they were incredibly inspired, and they went back to Switzerland, and they opened it there, and Switzerland had a visionary president, one of the best people I've ever met, Ruth Dreyfus, who championed heroin prescription. And now ever since that happened, they've had heroin prescription in Switzerland. The deaths in those clinics since they began 20 years ago are zero. They have no deaths among addicts there now. And what's even more amazing is Swiss people who are really right-wing. My dad's Swiss. They are they're really right wing. They have voted twice in referenda to keep heroin legal for addicts. Right? It's because it works so well. So that's the thing I would say about what legalization looks like for hard drugs. Some people, when you talk about legalization, they think you're saying there should be a heroin aisle at Boots. You know, that's not what anyone wants, right? We already have different models of regulation for different drugs, right? We are in a room full of alcohol, right? That's one model of regulation. That's the model of regulation I would use for cannabis, right? Kids aren't allowed in here. The lovely guy with the Indian jumper on the bar would be so very seriously punished if he sold to children. That's the model we should have there, and we have regulated hours. Doesn't go all night. Obviously, there are different model of, with say, sleeping pills, right? I can't go to this bar and buy sleeping pills. I can't go into Boots and buy powerful sleeping pills. I have to go to the doctor. We have different models of regulation for different drugs, which is, of course, what legalization would mean.
Suppose we use heroin as a sort of extreme case and an extreme example of the down and outs. Do you think that there's any instance of the middle classes getting their highs, getting their euphoria, getting their triumph and heroism on Thursday, Friday and Saturday nights out instead of political motivation?
This is a really important point. I'm really glad you said that. This is massively important. The UN Office of Drug Control is the main drug war body in the world, right? They are the keepers of the drug war. Their slogan is, a drug-free world, we can do it. And, which tells you a lot. And a couple of years ago, they made an incredible admission, which actually I've noticed has been taken down from their website. I was trying to find it the other day. They said that if I said to you, what proportion of drug use, currently illegal drug use, is non-problematic? So it doesn't damage the health of the user, doesn't kill them, doesn't give them an overdose, doesn't give them some problem in the long term, they don't become addicted. Do you want to just give me some numbers? Guess, anyone? 90%. Yeah, you're right. 90%. Most, if they haven't been primed to think it's a weird number, people usually guess about 30%. And it's really interesting. 90% of all drug use is non-problematic. And if we think about alcohol, right, loads of you are drinking alcohol. I don't drink alcohol, as it happens, right? So I feel morally superior here. I'm joking. Loads of you are drinking alcohol, right? Is there anyone in this room who's anxious or nervous that they are surrounded by alcohol users? No, because although no one here is going to deny the reality of alcoholism, and it's horrific, we know that it's a small minority of alcohol users, and that those people had other problems that led them to want to not be present in their lives, right? That's actually true of all other drugs. And this amazed me. I interviewed a man called Dr. Carl Hart, who's a professor of neuroscience at Columbia University in New York. And sorry, I listened back the other day to the interviews with him, and I probably shouldn't say this, but Carl Hart is the most good-looking man I've ever met, right? And in all my other interviews, I ask really incisive questions. And then with Carl Hart, for the first 2 times I interviewed him, I'm just like, ha, Carl, you're so right. Anyway, sorry, I shouldn't say that. But when I got over that, and I looked at his figures, it's really striking. Even crack and meth, the vast majority of people who use crack and meth are not harmed by them, which is viscerally shocking. And if I hadn't gone through the figures again and again, I flatly wouldn't believe it. It's worth remembering, meth was prescribed as an antidepressant to 1950s housewives for a really long time, methamphetamine. When I say picture a meth addict, you don't picture a slightly manic 1950s housewife. You're absolutely right. Not only are you right, the overwhelming majority of drug use is what you're describing. Addiction is a very small subset. And which leads me very nicely to the next thing I was going to talk about.
Just to follow up on that, because those of us who don't have an addiction problem, our militant tendency and others like that are right. I think we have all had, some of us I'm sure have had rubbish days working bullshit jobs, buying our Ben Sherman shirts and all the rest of it. Life's not great. Here we are having a drink, we'll feel better as a result of that. Would it actually be better if we weren't doing that, so that we were more angry and more likely to do something about it?
Oh, okay. So there are people who... I don't think the reason why people aren't rising up in Britain is because there's alcohol is available. I think it's a much deeper and broader question than that. I also think, I think from what you were saying as well, sometimes you get people who say that, legalization is like a middle-class indulgence of an issue, because it's okay for you and your kids. In fact, literally, people said this the other day when Branson and Nick Clegg, I saw a piece in the Daily Mail, which I actually hadn't read in years. God, it's awful, isn't it? someone saying, this is a middle-class indulgence, it's easy for you to say this. Actually, the exact opposite is the truth. Drugs are effectively already decriminalised for middle-class people in Britain, right? Richard Branson's son isn't going to be arrested. He's not going to, nothing bad's going to happen to him. Okay, so he buys slightly shittier drugs, and that's a problem. But, actually, the exact opposite is the truth. The people who pay the price for the policy we have are poor people, who they're the people the places where they live are shit because there's a war for drugs going on there. The shittier, they're the ones who go to prison. They're the ones who get harassed by the police. They're the ones who get arrested. They're the ones who, when things go wrong, don't get a nice rehab place, get a terrible life. So I would say it's the exact opposite of a middle class indulgence. If you were solely interested in nice bourgeois people's lives, they're doing there's still problems, but they're doing all right. It's everyone else. It's the people in Juarez, it's the people in Baltimore, and it's the poor people in Britain who get and particularly black people in Britain who get screwed over.
I was just wondering why we couldn't have heroin oil in Boots. It's a really effective painkiller, and a lot of use is non-problematic. But although it's a really useful painkiller, it's very frequently not prescribed. I've got brittle bones. I've had about 80 fractures in my life. A lot of them were when I was much younger, but I'm 35 now, and I was never given morphine ever until I was 29. And then once I'd been given it once in hospital, the pain clinic said, okay, you can have some on an ongoing basis. So, given that it has such a powerful medicinal use, and seeing as so much usage isn't harmful, why couldn't we have it available in Boots next to the paracetamol, which is arguably a more harmful drug?
This is super important. I actually wrote a bit for the book about this and didn't use it. I'll email it to you tomorrow, Lisa, because one of the absolute scandals about the war on drugs is that in the name of the drug war, people are denied access to painkillers that work all over the world. It's shocking, the figures on this, and there's the Drug Policy Alliance in America have done really good work on this. You're totally right that the one that's got a lot of publicity rightly is medical marijuana, where marijuana is very good for things like multiple sclerosis, and it's denied to huge numbers of people for no good reason. Really just dogma and prejudice. And the same is true. What I would say with that is you are being currently denied a pain reliever that would massively improve your life. What I would do in that situation is look at making a much lower threshold to get a prescription for those things. So, and that's partly about just undoing the dogma of the kind of irrational prejudices about these drugs, where we believe that they have kind of magical qualities that can kind of magically hijack people. And that actually leads to the second thing I want to say, which is related to that. Pick me up on it in the question if I don't talk about it. But so we talked a bit about legalization and what that means. In the year 2000, Portugal had
Johann, there's also another question on the Johann. There's another question on.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I didn't. Sorry, I'm blind.
So just. Oh, okay. We'll go on.
Okay.
Carry on.
We'll come back to it if you like. So in the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? That's a lot of people. And every year they tried the American way more and more. They arrested more people, imprisoned more people, cut them off from the workforce, and every year the problem got worse. And one day, the leader of the opposition and the prime minister got together, and they effectively said, look, we can't go on like this. We can't have 1% of our population addicted to heroin. What are we going to do? And they said, look, why don't we just set up a panel of doctors and scientists and get them to just go away and figure out what would actually solve this. And let's get all the parties to agree in advance that whatever they recommend, we will do. So let's just take it out of politics. It was an incredibly bold move. And they got a guy called João Goulão, who was a doctor who set up the first rehab clinic in Portugal, to go away and lead this panel. I should just say about Portuguese names, if anyone here speaks Portuguese, I cannot say Portuguese. Whenever I would say, how do I say your name? They go, João Goulão, because I've got a name that's said wrong a lot of times. They go, João Goulão, and I would go, João Goulão, and they would go, no, João Goulão. And I simply cannot say any of their names. I don't know why. Anyway, a name something like João Goulão. He goes away, and they look at all the best evidence, and they go away for a year and a half, and they go everywhere, and they look at everything, and they come back, and they say, decriminalise all drugs. from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next stage, take all the money we currently spend on arresting, imprisoning, ruining the lives of addicts, and spend all that money on the lesson of Rat Park, reconnect them with the society. So the way that works is, say, so it goes back to exactly what the guy at the back was saying, for the 90% who use drugs and don't have any problem with it, the government has no problem with you. The government doesn't go looking for you, they don't go and find you. If you get, I don't know, involved in a street fight and they find you with cocaine, they do take it off you and they refer you to something called the Dissuasion Commission. You have to go within a few days. It's a bit like a parking ticket. There's no legal implication. It's a bit like a parking ticket. I went and sat in on it. You go, you meet a social worker and a psychologist, and they say to you, are you an addict? If you are, we can get you into treatment now. If you're not, here's some advice. If you were using cocaine, they'll say, don't use it on your own. This is how to spot if you're having an overdose, that kind of thing. And they say, good luck. And that's it. If you're an addict, they do it differently. If they identify you're an addict, they give you a massive amount of help to turn your life around. And partly that's things like the things we think of as drug treatment here, so like rehab, that kind of thing. Actually, most of it isn't that. Most of it is getting people subsidised jobs or helping them to set up businesses. So say you used to be a mechanic, right? And your life fell apart. When you're ready and you've been given some psychological help, they'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year as a mechanic, we'll pay half his wages. So, or there were a group of addicts that Johann was talking to me about, you know, who were given a micro loan to set up a small business of removal firms, to set up a removal firm. And it worked really well. And all the other addicts had a really strong incentive to help all their friends stay clean, stay out of trouble, you know, and so on. And it's now been, what is it? It's 15 years this year. Since this experiment, no, 14 years, will be 15 years soon, since this experiment began. And the results are in. Injecting drug use is down by 50% in Portugal, 50%. Every study shows overall addiction is down, overdose is massively down, HIV transmission among addicts is massively down. And one of the things, it was probably the most moving interview I did in a funny sort of way, was with this guy called João Figueira, another name that I'm definitely saying wrong. He was the top drug cop in Portugal. And he led the opposition to the decriminalisation. And he said a lot of the things that a lot of you guys are going to be thinking, which is surely if you decriminalise everything, surely there'll be like all sorts of problems. And he said to me, the exact words are in the book, but something like, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt ashamed that he'd spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug users. And everyone in Portugal now sees that there's a much better way. And it was really striking. They've got 5 main political parties in Portugal. None of them wants to go back. When people see the alternatives, you know, they see that they work and that the things that they fear don't happen.
In writing your book and everything that you're doing around sort of your book as like a catalyst for the war on drugs, what have you been thinking about? Like as who is your audience? Like who are you sort of speaking to, like using this book as a catalyst?
I can tell you I'm not talking to, and it's interesting. Lots of people keep coming up to me and saying, if only we could get our politicians to read this. And a guy emailed me and offered, said, you know, I'm going to buy a copy and send it to every US senator. And I thought of something that someone I really admire, named Chomsky, says. He said he's one of the very few disagreements he has with his Quaker friends is where they say, tell the truth to power. And he always says, I don't need to tell Henry Kissinger the truth. He knows the truth. He's just a psycho. He doesn't give a damn, right? And actually, I think trying to persuade people at the top is how not to do social change. Actually, I think the analogy for how we're going to change this is the gay rights movement, right? What happened with gay rights is not that we went and persuaded politicians at the top to be nicer to gay people. Actually, the political class was always a little bit more pro-gay than the population. What we had to do was persuade ordinary people, and they made the politicians change. And in the same way, we need to have a social change. The people I'd most like to speak to, if I tell you one story just quickly, I'm going to try to do this story as quickly as I can. It's the most moving story, the most moving person I met for my book. In the year 2000, there was a homeless street addict in Vancouver, on the downtown east side of Vancouver, called Bud Osborne. And the downtown east side, there'll be some people who've been there. Downtown east side is famously the place in North America that has the highest concentration of addicts anywhere in North America. It's the place at the end of the line, in the city at the end of the line in North America. And Bud was watching his friends die all around him. People would shoot up behind dumpsters so the cops wouldn't see them, but if the cops can't see you, no one can see you, you start to OD, you die, you get found a few days later. And Bud thought, I cannot watch my friends die and do nothing. But he also thought, look, I'm a homeless junkie. Those are the words he would have used. What can I do? And Bud had a really simple idea. He got together a load of the addicts and he said, when we're not using, which even for hardcore addicts is most of the time, why don't we just have a timetable and arrange a patrol, and we'll just walk up and down the alleyways, and if we spot someone ODing, we'll call an ambulance. No officials, no fancy stuff, just us. And they started to do it. And the overdose rate started to really fall on the downtown east side, which was a great thing in itself because it meant people were living who otherwise would have died. But it also meant the addicts started to think about themselves a bit differently. They were like, maybe we're not the pieces of shit everyone says we are. Maybe we can do something. And they started to turn up at public meetings about the menace of the addicts, right? And they would sit at the back, and after a while they'd put up their hands and go, I think you're talking about us. Is there anything we could do differently? And sometimes people would be really angry, and sometimes they'd say, you leave your needles lying around. And Bud said, that's fine. We'll extend the patrol, we'll go and pick up the needles. And they started doing it. And people started to think differently about the addicts, but then they decided, Bud went and started reading about this in the Vancouver Library, and he learned that in Frankfurt they had opened safe injecting rooms where addicts could go and legally use drugs and be monitored by doctors, and overdose had virtually ended in Frankfurt. And Bud thought, well, we have to do that here, but nothing like that happened in North America since Anslinger. So Bud decided, he got a load of his friends together. It was quite a big group, about 200 addicts, and they decided to stalk the mayor of Vancouver, Philip Owen, everywhere he went with a coffin. And the coffin said something like, who will die next, Philip Owen, before you open a safe injecting room? And Philip Owen was the most unlikely man to lobby on this issue. Philip Owen was a right-wing guy from a very rich family, a businessman. Picture Mitt Romney or David Cameron, you've got some idea. He'd said that the solution to addiction was to take all the addicts and detain them at the local military base and never let them out. And for 2 years, they follow Philip Owen everywhere he goes in public with this coffin. And they get pretty disheartened because nothing changes. And one day, to his eternal credit, Philip Owen says, who the fuck are these people? And he goes incognito to the downtown east side, and he spends a load of time with addicts. And he's blown away. He had no idea. And he goes to meet Milton Friedman, who I've mentioned before, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who was very good on this issue and terrible on everything else. And Milton Friedman explained to him the drug war and how it works, because he'd grown up under alcohol prohibition in Chicago. And Philip Owen came back to Vancouver and he held a press conference. And he had the chief of police, the coroner, and a representative of the addicts. And he said he would never speak again about addiction without having addicts present. And he was going to open the first safe injecting room in the whole of North America. They were going to have the most compassionate drug policies in North America. And things were going to change. Philip Owen opened the injecting room. His right-wing party was so horrified they deselected him. He was then the right-wing candidate they put up, was then beaten by a liberal candidate who kept the injecting room open. And when I went to the downtown east side and met Bud and met Philip Owen, it was 10 years on and the results were in. And overdose deaths were down by 80%. And average life expectancy on the downtown east side had improved by 10 years. And Philip Owen told me he would sacrifice his whole political career all over again, and it was the proudest thing he ever did. And Bud, after I got to know him, and you can listen to the interviews on the website, Bud died last year. He was only 62, but he'd been a homeless addict during a drug war, and it had fucked him up. And when Bud died, they sealed off the streets where he had lived as a homeless person, and they had this incredible memorial service. And huge numbers of people in that crowd knew they were alive because of what Bud had done. And to me, the story of what Bud did and that movement in Vancouver is a model for political change. Bud did not sit around waiting for a leader, right? It's hard to think of a more powerless person in our culture than a homeless street addict. And because of what he did, literally thousands of people are alive now. And the Canadian Supreme Court has ruled that addicts have an inalienable right to life, and that includes a safe injecting room. And they can never shut that down now. And to me, that's a model where you and also Philip Owen, I could not be less politically sympathetic to Philip Owen. What an amazing man. He listened to those people, and he was a really unlikely candidate to listen. And they appealed to his decency, and they appealed to the decency of the people of Vancouver. And they won, and it had an amazing effect. And I would just say the thing I took from Bud's story, I mean, I learned a lot from Bud, but one thing I took from him is you are so much more powerful than you think. You know, small numbers of people appealing to the decency of their fellow citizens can have incredible power.
Like this lady here, I'm also studying, I'm doing a master's in addiction, funnily enough.
Oh,
so your book
hooray.
came out at an incredibly useful time for me. But it's, obviously I'll finish this year and then I'm going to go into a career with it. But I was just wondering, you know, faced with the really compelling evidence from countries like Portugal and Switzerland and Scandinavia and seeing policies in action that work and that help kind of repair the lives destroyed by addiction, how optimistic are you that something similar will happen in the UK? Because that is a big concern, is that I'm going to go into this field and nothing's going to change, and you're going to be fighting the same battles over and over again, and it is a big concern. I was wondering how optimistic you are that things might change in that respect.
The only time I ever saw my dad cry in his whole life, my dad was from Switzerland, but my parents lived in Berlin for a long time. Before I was born, my brother was born there. And when I was 10 years old, I came home and my dad was crying. And I was like, oh, what's happened? And they were looking at the television and the Berlin Wall was coming down. And my dad was, I mean, he was happy. He wasn't like a Stalinist. And he just said, I never thought this would happen. And when I heard the result from Colorado and Washington, that at the heart of the American drug war, they have voted to legalize marijuana, I thought this might be the first axe into the Berlin Wall. I am cautiously optimistic. Drug policy will be as good as we make it, right? What will not happen is politicians seeing the light. Philip Owen on his own would never have come to that conclusion, right? It will not happen if privately people like David Cameron and Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg, and actually I would never praise this man in any other context. Nigel Farage is really good on this issue, or used to be. They kind of agree with us already. They're waiting for permission. They're waiting for us to stand down the Daily Mail or stand up against it. You know, and it depends on how well people like us do our job. You know, we've got to. I think this is an interesting one because it's not like, say, the gay rights fight. There's an area in which it's very like the gay rights and an area in which it's not. With homophobes, at the end of the day, we just have to, of course we must try to persuade them, but ultimately we have fundamentally different views of the world, right? I believe in the equality of gay people, they don't, right? There's just an incommensurable difference. Interestingly, with this debate, I actually don't think that's the case. When I speak to most, of course there are kind of racists who are prohibitionists or so on, and you can't really bargain with that, but actually most prohibitionists, the things they're motivated by are totally admirable things that I agree with. They don't want kids to use drugs. They don't want people to become addicted. They don't want there to be criminality. I totally agree. We share the same values. The only difference is about how we achieve them. And I think the method they're proposing can be proven doesn't achieve those goals. And the method that I'm guessing you and me would support does achieve those goals. So in some ways, I think it's actually an easier fight than some of these other fights, because actually we're much closer together than they think. You know, it's not about, you know, one thing you really see a degree of relief on. Tonya Winchester, who led the Washington marijuana campaign, is an amazing person, says in the book something like, you know, the first thing she would say to people when they were campaigning was, I'm not asking you to like marijuana. I don't like marijuana. I don't smoke marijuana. I don't want to smoke marijuana. I'm not asking you to be in favour of drug use. I'm asking you, do you think the right way to respond to drug use is for it to be controlled by armed criminal gangs and for us to ruin people's lives if they do use them? Or do you think we should use the money sensibly? And that, to me, there's a particularly charged bit around this, which is like, we're not asking people to like drugs. Like I said before, I don't drink alcohol. No one would find it, or I drink a few glasses of wine every year. No one would find it weird that I don't drink alcohol and I'm against alcohol prohibition. We need to get to a position where people don't find it weird that you can be anti-drugs and anti-drug prohibition.
I was a drug addict. I took many different forms. I never took ketamine, though, which was my big staple in life. but when I was coming off it, I went to see my doctor. I was going through various different things, and they offered me various other mood enhanциfiers or mood alternatives, which were basically legal pharmaceutical drugs, things like Prozac, etc., 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 which aren't such a big problem in this country as what they would be seen in middle class North America. I haven't read your book, so I don't know. I've come into this fresh. I've literally walked in off the street. Where do we sit in terms of if we decriminalise illegal drugs, but we have a health service or a government or an institution somewhere within this country who offers these alternatives? Are we pushing the problem from one place to another place?
This is really interesting. One of the things that was fascinating is looking at how arbitrary the line between a legal and an illegal drug. There's an example in my own family. I'm trying to think of how I can phrase this that doesn't completely compromise there. I had a relative who was a cocaine addict, and she had a son who was prescribed Ritalin, my nephew. And, that could be a few people. That's more than one person. And it's okay, she's kind of talked about it publicly, sorry. And I remember, and Cocaine and Ritalin is a great book called The Cult of Pharmacology by Richard de Grandpré, where he talks about cocaine and Ritalin are incredibly similar chemically and in terms of their effects on the brain. And I remember just thinking, how mad, when I would go and see them, and I remember thinking, how mad that what you're doing is a crime for which you could go to prison, and what you're doing to your son is something that the school demanded to make him behave well. What a crazy situation. And loads of drugs, you see that with heroin, right? We were talking about before, heroin. So you've got someone in a hospital bed being given heroin, and someone in the alleyway outside using it recreationally, and they will be treated completely differently. So I think you're right that that's a totally arbitrary line. And like you're saying, you were offered very similar, I'm guessing, very similar drugs to the ones that you were using. In the Swiss heroin prescription program that was inspired by John Marks and what happened in the Wirral, I was surprised by this. You go in, you're referred by a doctor, say it had been you. You can set your dose for the heroin, and they'll give it to you for as long as you want, and you will never be pressured to cut down your dose or stop. And I thought, that's a bit, even to me, I was like, that seems a bit much. And what was fascinating is, so people go on, they start at a high dose, and because the chaos of being a street user and having to get all the money and all of that stuff stops, and prostituting yourself or whatever stops, you start to get your life together. They help you to get housing and stuff like that. Interestingly, almost everyone over time just voluntarily, remember there's no pressure, voluntarily chooses to reduce their dose over time and eventually stop. So the program's been running for like 20 years and there's almost no one from the beginning who's still on it, even though they all could be. And what's fascinating to that about me is that sometimes it's framed as, including by people I admire in this issue, sometimes it's framed, there's a debate that's framed as like, so you've got abstinence here, and you've got substitution therapies, prescriptions here, and they're like opposing ends. Actually, what's fascinating about the reality of what happened in Switzerland is that the substitution therapy leads to, maybe not abstinence, but because some of them go on to methadone and things, but a really significant reduction in drug use, because you just get your life back together, and your life's not shit anymore. And you've got, the way I would put it is, I'll end with this thought. We could all be drunk now, right? Forget the drug laws. Totally legally, we could all be drunk. Very few of us are, probably none. And the reason why isn't because anyone's stopping us using the law. It's because we've got something we want to be present for in our lives. We've got jobs we like. We've got books we want to read. We've got TV shows we want to watch. But most crucially, we've got friends. And we've got people we want to be present in our lives for. And the reason why most people choose not to be present in their lives is because their life isn't a place that anyone would want to be present in. And we need to improve people's lives the way to, and this is a real challenge to me, obviously, with the addiction in my family. You know, when I came back from learning all this, I was determined. I was determined to do the opposite of the drug war. To say to the addicts in my life, and it's not easy, to say, I will never cut you off, and I will always try and sit with you and listen to you, whether you're clean or whether you're not, and to try to strengthen the connection and the bond, because I think that's the only way we'll get out of addiction. It's the only way we'll get out of the drug war, is if we are connected to each other as human beings. With that thought, it sounded like a Jerry Springer final, just to end with another shit 1980s TV reference, like a Jerry Springer, look after yourselves and each other moment. I will now sign books, babies, tumours, anything you want. I'll just be over there. Thank you very much. Cheers.